there are some towering figures in the Old Testament. You have Abraham, the friend of God. You have Joseph, of whom it was written, the Lord was with him. You have David, described as a man after God's own heart. You have Elijah, the fearless prophet in a time of apostasy in Israel. And there is someone who deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as these mighty men of God, and that is, of course, Moses, the deliverer, the leader, and the lawgiver of Israel. And I'd like us to go through this man's life and ministry as a means, really, of doing a whistle-stop tour of the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch. Now, in 1998, an animated and romanticised film version of Moses' life went into the cinemas, and it proved to be quite a hit. I don't know whether anyone's seen it on DVD. The Prince of Egypt. Good, the Prince of Egypt. And you can understand why, as Moses' life makes for a great story, and that this version of his life got the full Hollywood treatment. Unsurprisingly, there were some anomalies in the film, however. Moses somehow managed to look the same young man of his early years as he did when he was 80 years old, when he was called into God's service. Not sure if it was quite like that in Exodus 3. I hope then that we can capture more of the reality of the man, of God, and of God's dealings with him over these next few months. More reality than a film glamorising his life did. I hope that we'll see his character, warts and all, those triumphs that he experienced, the mistakes he made, the pressures he was subjected to, the times when he actually lost his temper, and the disappointments that he had to endure. But moreover, I think we'll see something, learn something about the nature and character of God, about his holiness, his faithfulness, and his great power. And I hope also that we'll see in Moses delivering Israel out of slavery in Egypt a foreshadowing of an even greater delivery when the Lord Jesus, 1500 years or so later, would deliver sinful people out of their, not physical bondage, but their slavery to sin. Well, why was Moses such a remarkable figure? Well, 3 attributes of his came to mind. Firstly, as our reading confirms in Hebrews 11, he was a man of extraordinary faith. But he was also a man dedicated to prayer. And perhaps the greatest example of intercessory prayer in the Old Testament is Moses's, recorded in Exodus 32. Moses praying for his wayward people after the debacle of the golden calf. But he was also a man of great humility. And we read these lovely words about his character. Now, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. I think there are some Bible translations that use the word meek, which is much the same thing. Many people, don't they, when they go up in the world, they lose their humility. But the further Moses rose in stature, wonderfully, the more humble he became. And the last thing that we should bear in mind about Moses, by way of introduction, is that he was a great writer. And he wrote a substantial part of the Old Testament. And Jesus certainly believed this. And we've seen this from John's Gospel. Back in chapter 5, Jesus is debating with the Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem after the healing of the crippled man by the pool of Bethesda. And he gives them this rebuke. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you did not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? So Moses was a man full of faith. He was prayerful, he was humble, and to boot, he was a great writer. Now, our title for this series comes from a Bible passage at the very end of his life, written by someone else as a kind of postscript summing up Moses' godliness. And it's from Deuteronomy 34, verse 10. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And that's our series title, Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. That's our series title. Before we look at Moses' birth, we'll set the scene by going through chapter 1. And so I've got 4 brief headings for you. And firstly, we see in verses 1 to 7 what are called the baby boom. The baby boom. Now, the connection between the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus immediately becomes apparent. Genesis ends with the death of Joseph at the age of 110 and his body being placed in a coffin in Egypt. And the Hebrew text of Exodus begins with the word "and." So our church Bible should really read, "And these were the names of the sons of Israel." And by this, Moses means to say that the story about to begin in Exodus is not a new story, but it's a new chapter in the same story of God's redemption plan, which begins with his call to Abraham to leave Ur and travel to a distant land, Canaan, which would one day become the land of his descendants, the nation of Israel. And God's plan for his historic people, Israel, included a prolonged resettlement in Egypt when Abraham's grandson Jacob brought his family over from Canaan to escape a severe famine there. And as we saw last year, his son Joseph, through the amazing providences of God, had become the highly respected Prime Minister of Egypt. And he was in a position to offer his family a home in Egypt where there was sufficient food for everyone due to his careful planning. There were then some 350 years since Jacob and his sons had resettled in Egypt and the beginning of the book of Exodus. Jacob had arrived with his 11 sons and their families, and they had numbered 70 people. Now, in the West today, we're living, aren't we, in times of a declining birth rate. For instance, in the UK, last year's birth rate per woman was 1.41 children. This compares with 2.01 children 50 years earlier. But the opposite was true in those 350 years since the Israelites had resettled in Egypt. They had babies like rabbits. The Israelite women were exceedingly fertile. As verse 7 puts it, they multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. There was a baby boom among the Israelites. By the time of the Exodus, 430 years after Jacob and his sons had resettled in Egypt, scholars estimate, with children, women and children, the total number of Israelites leaving Egypt was some 2 million people. So Israel had entered Egypt as a family, but it had left as a nation. Therefore, you had a nation within a nation at the beginning of Exodus. The nation of Israel was living among the Egyptians in Egypt. And it's in the setting of this baby boom among the Israelites then that the new king accedes to the throne of Egypt. And that's our second heading, the new broom, verses 8 to 14. Now, we have that expression in English of the new broom coming into a position of responsibility and power in an organisation and who wants to make an immediate impression. The new broom wants to make sweeping changes, if you excuse the pun. Now, what do we read about this new broom in verse 8? Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. The ESV puts it like this: Now there arose a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. In 1985, I was part of a youth scheme with the London City Mission called Voluntary Evangelism. And I remember going to the London City Mission Thanksgiving service that year, at which the then minister of Westminster Chapel, Dr. R.T. Kendall, preached. And I seem to remember that he preached from the book of Jonah, and he had a memorable line in his sermon. God said go, and Jonah said no. I remember that line. But what I also remember about the meeting was the interview with and the testimony of a London City missionary who worked, if my memory serves me right, in the London ambulance service. And he said this. He said his right to work among these men and women was at the discretion at the head of the ambulance service. If a new broom took over, it could be a case of, and now he quoted this verse, now there arose a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And as a consequence, he would lose his right to serve as a missionary and spiritual counsellor among those in the ambulance service. It wouldn't matter about all the good work he'd done in the past and all the people that he'd helped practically and had given spiritual support to. A new broom might be ignorant of this and might take the view that the London ambulance service did not need a London City missionary. And sadly, in the 40 years since, new brooms have come into London's public services and have decided the organisations they head up don't need Christian missionaries in an increasingly secular capital city. We know about the work of cross-teach in schools up and down the country and in Kent. And cross-teach, like many other Christian organisations working in today's schools, well, cross-teach faces the same problem. The cross-teach worker may have enjoyed a good relationship with a keen member of staff in the school, but if this staff member leaves or retires, and the new broom doesn't want Christian workers in the school, well, that's the end of the work. Now there arose a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And this is a very real problem in secular Britain today. We're living in times where many people do not understand or do not appreciate all the good Christianity has historically done. Well, how then did this new broom in Egypt view the Israelites? Well, simply put, with suspicion and with fear. For him, Joseph was just a name in a history book. He was just a figure from the distant past. He was ignorant about how Joseph the Israelite had saved Egypt from starvation, how he, through careful stewardship and excellent organisation, had made Egypt the bread basket of the world at a time of famine, how he'd been able to store up oceans of grain. He was ignorant of how the Lord had been with Joseph and how everything he turned his hand to prospered because the God of Israel's favour rested on him. So this new broom had an entirely different attitude to the Israelites. He didn't see them as allies, but as potential traitors. Therefore, he enslaved them and he adopted a policy of work them to death. And the new broom and his henchmen made the Israelites' lives a misery as forced labour in building two new cities, Pithom and Ramesses, and also as agricultural workers in the fields under the hot and unrelenting sun of the Middle East. But this work them to death strategy did not work. It didn't curtail the birth rate among the Israelites. In fact, it had the opposite effect. Instead of discouraging the Israelites from having children, they had even more. So we see in verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, with the consequence that the Egyptians came to fear them even more and worked them ever more ruthlessly. This is the first case of anti-Semitism in history. And it's a chilling pointer, isn't it, to what would happen much later when a new broom came to power in Germany in 1933 and Adolf Hitler became Reichskanzler. Not only did the Jews in Germany forfeit their homes and businesses, they were either sent to concentration camps on inhumanely overcrowded trains to die in gas chambers, or they were forced to work as slave labour on behalf of the Nazi regime. So what was happening here in Egypt 1500 years BC was a grim foreshadowing of what that tragic era of German history, 1933 to 1945. And with the events of just a few days ago in Heaton Park, Manchester, we know that the evil of anti-Semitism is still with us. So we've got the new broom, so we've got the baby boom, the new broom, and then thirdly, enter the pro-life midwives. Now, when Pharaoh realises that this work them to death strategy wasn't working, he devises an even more sinister plan: infanticide. And he targets the two Israelite midwives and he issues them with a royal order. Let the Israelite baby girls live, but smother the baby boys so they die. It's too horrible, isn't it, to dwell on. But we read that these midwives were staunchly pro-life. After all, you'd expect them to be, wouldn't you? Their whole vocation in life was to facilitate life, not to destroy it. Pharaoh was ordering them to do something that went right against the grain of their calling as midwives. It's a bit like the dilemma doctors will face if the assisted dying legislation becomes law. It goes right against the Hippocratic oath of the medical profession not to harm the patient, but always to benefit him or her. But there was an even more important factor at work in the midwife's decision to disregard the royal command and let the baby boys live. These two ladies, Shiphrah and Puah, feared God, and as a result engaged in an act of civil disobedience. They put God's moral law before Pharaoh's royal law. They took the same attitude as their ancestor Joseph had taken centuries before. How can I do such a wicked thing and sin against the Lord? They feared God rather than Pharaoh. And they resorted to a little economizing with the truth to keep it from him. Now, we have that long-running television series on BBC One, which has become a staple of Sunday evening viewing in the winter months, Call the Midwife. And the plot usually goes along these lines. A telephone call arrives at the home where the midwives live, that the baby is on its way, and the midwife responsible immediately drops everything. She gets on a bike and cycles at whatever hour it is to the expectant mother's home to oversee the delivery. It's all heartwarming stuff, comfort TV, I think they call it. But in ancient Egypt, the Israelite midwives protest that the Israelite women were very efficient at giving birth. They didn't have to endure a long labour, and they gave birth quickly. So quickly, in fact, that the babies were already born and were safe in their mother's arms before they arrived on the scene and could carry out Pharaoh's instruction. And this is the yarn they spin to Pharaoh when he realizes the baby Israelite boys were alive and thriving. Augustine, the early church theologian, made this wry observation on the Israelite midwives' little white lie. God rewarded them for their godliness, but not their deceit. And he rewarded them with families and children of their own, verse 21. And here's the thing, their God-fearing has been remembered for all time. Whereas we don't know Pharaoh's name, who gave the order to kill the newborn baby boys, we do know the names of the midwives who saved them. God saw to it that their obedience to him was not forgotten. It was better, therefore, to be a humble Israelite midwife than a mighty Egyptian king. This is what the late James Montgomery Boyce has written. The world exalts the great and despises the lowly. But in God's way of doing things, usually exalted people are brought low and lowly people are exalted. At least if they do the right thing out of reverence for God. So you've got the baby boom, the new broom, the pro-life midwives, and finally we see, verse 22, the killing field. Actually, it's a killing river. It was the river Nile in Egypt which was become the killing field. And this is what the Nile looks like today. But in 1500 BC, it was a place where the Israelites carried out infanticide against the Israelites. Whether Pharaoh believed the midwives' tale that the Israelite women gave birth too quickly for them to intervene, well, we're not told. But he was determined to carry on with his policy of not allowing the Israelite baby boys to live. Therefore, he takes the onus off the midwives to kill the baby boys, and he places it on his own subjects. And whenever the Egyptians hear of an Israelite baby boy being born, they're to take him and throw him into the Nile so that he drowns. Again, it's a thing too horrible to contemplate. But Pharaoh's determined. Over time, the Israelite male population would eventually die out, and the new generation of Israelite women would be forced to marry Egyptian men and have children with them who would be brought up as Egyptians. The alternative, of course, was that they wouldn't marry at all and would remain childless, so that the Israelite people would shrink in number and would eventually die out entirely. Pharaoh then, like Hitler after him, was ruthless in his determination to eradicate what he saw as his Jewish problem. And he was driven by fear, as many brutal people so often are. Fear of loss of position, fear of loss of power, fear of loss of face, fear of exposure, fear of their own weaknesses, fear of losing control of the situation. So this then is the setting for Moses to enter the world in chapter 2. Since the arrival of Jacob and his sons in Egypt, there'd been the baby boom of Israelites, so that their number grew rapidly. A new broom comes to power that had no appreciation of all the good the Israelite Joseph had done centuries before. And Pharaoh decides on a policy of infanticide, which the pro-Israelite midwives, pro-life midwives ignore and let the baby boys live. So Pharaoh makes Egypt into a killing field, and he instructs his people to seize the Israelite baby boys and throw them into the Nile. What therefore is the text of chapter 1 saying to us? Well, surely this. There are two kinds of people. a God-fearing people as represented by the midwives, and a people who have no regard for God, and therefore who have no moral compass, and who act cruelly and callously, as represented by Pharaoh. And his attitude is famously summed up a few chapters later with his question and then statement. Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. So God-fearing people, therefore, will inevitably clash and come into conflict with people who don't. It's inevitable. What then does God do for his people at this time of national crisis, when they're being treated inhumanely and their baby boys are being drowned? He sends a baby. He sends them a baby who in years to come will become their deliverer. And so we have in chapter 2, verse 2, the record of the birth of Moses. Does that sound familiar to you? Later in the New Testament. And we will begin his story next week. Amen.